Good morning, everybody. How are you? So I apologize. I'm going to present to you in English this morning, so bear with me. I will try and go slow enough to where the translation makes sense for you. I was asked to discuss the beef supply chain and the role that Angus cattle play in satisfying consumer demand. And I think that this presentation fits very nicely with the presentation that you've just heard regarding marketing and the opportunities afforded Angus cattle pretty much everywhere that I've been in the world. So I want to start out and just take a look at the supply chain. All of us are familiar with this, and really it doesn't matter which country that you produce cattle in. The supply chain is mostly the same. We have seed stock production, which can be broken into elite seed stock and multiplier cattle. We have the commercial cow-calf portion of the industry. We wean calves, and then in Uruguay you would finish cattle intensively on grass. In the United States and other parts of the world, we would finish cattle on high concentrate diets in confined animal feeding systems. And then the livestock move to the harvest process, where they are then fabricated into cuts and trimmings, which are then sold at retail and food service establishments. As you think about that supply chain, the cattle industry around the world is a bit unique in that unlike poultry production or pork production or perhaps other agricultural commodities, each one of those segments of the supply chain have independent owners or independents associated from other parts of the supply chain. And that becomes important when we talk about trying to generate the qualities that are important for marketing beef ultimately to consumers. I've listed for you on this slide, and I won't read it to you, but I've listed some of the things that affect the eating quality of beef products that are sold to consumers. And one thing you'll notice on each of those categories that we talk about as being palatability, tenderness, flavor, and juiciness, in each of those cases we list the amount of marbling or the intramuscular fat in beef as being a component that's important to the eating satisfaction. And this is true based on our research almost everywhere that we've been in the world. And in fact, in studies that we've conducted with consumers, and this would be consumers in the United States, it becomes clear that when you have a bad eating experience that results from tenderness, then consumers are not willing to spend the same amount of money that they would if they had been satisfied with the tenderness of the beef. And interestingly enough, what becomes more important is not the fact that they were dissatisfied the first time with the tenderness of the beef, but the fact that they won't come back and purchase the product again becomes our biggest issue once we have a dissatisfaction experience. The same is true when we start talking about beef flavor. And in the United States, we feel like we've moved towards addressing some of the tenderness issues that we may have faced, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s. And once we begin to address those tenderness issues, then flavor becomes one of the important components of consumer desirability. In our studies, at least among common demographics for consumers, there's about a 15% of consumers that appreciate the flavor associated with grass-fed systems, and there's about 80 to 85% then that prefer the flavor associated with the concentrate feeding systems. But regardless of which of those systems they prefer the flavor of, they always respect the flavor that's associated with greater amounts of marbling, because the marbling, the intramuscular fat, ultimately is where the flavor is derived from in the beef. We have two sort of foundation research studies that were conducted in the United States that have sort of supported this concept over time. The first of those we refer to as the 1005 head study. It was conducted in the 1980s at Texas A&M University. And the second was conducted in our shop in 2013, so quite a number of years later, to evaluate the role that marbling plays in the satisfaction that consumers have for beef. And I want you to notice in the CSU study, we've broken flavor components into specific traits that comprise in totality the flavor that are important in distinguishing the flavor as being good or bad relative to beef. One of those flavors is the buttery beef flat flavor, and you can see that there's about a 71% of the variability that's explained in that flavor note based on the amount of marbling that's in the product. So that one flavor note has a huge impact on the demand and the desirability for beef. So all of you are Angus breeders and selectors, so you apply selection pressure to improve the various components that are associated with profitability of beef cattle. And so I just want to show you something that I think that becomes important relative to this particular trait. So this is tenderness ranking for muscles, the predominant muscles of the carcass. In this case, we've ranked 20 of the muscles. And these are ranked based on the muscles being aged for the appropriate amount of time. And not all muscles require the same amount of post-mortem aging to meet tenderness criteria that's important to consumers. Interestingly, all of these tenderness criteria for all of these muscles ultimately come back to genetic selection criteria associated with products. And I can show you literature that demonstrates conclusively that certain breeds and certain genetic lines of beef cattle have more or less problems associated with the tenderness across the board with these muscles than other breeds of cattle. In the United States, and I'm certain this is true most everywhere, the type of cattle that we're raising has changed significantly. In theory, this should reflect the demand that's imposed by consumers on the supply chain, but it hasn't always reflected that. If you look at the picture on the left, that was a San Antonio, Texas stock show winning steer, a Hereford, in 1958, compared to our most recent national champion, at least that I had a picture for, which was the National Western Stock Show in Denver, Colorado. And I think you can see the type of those steers is changing dramatically. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I won't spend time trying to convince you that I'm a geneticist, because everybody that knows me knows that I'm not. But I will make a couple important points, I think, that are relevant to some other data that I'm going to show you. So in the United States, this is a bull that is advertised. This particular bull is marketed by Gen X. And you can see that he particularly passes on traits that are associated with calving ease and the cows to which he's bred to. And if you look at the lower pink box, you'll see that his marbling EPD, his ribeye EPD, and his fatness EPD are relatively low, even with sort of moderate accuracy levels. Meaning that this bull is a really good bull to improve certain aspects of production that are important at the farm level of the industry, particularly calving ease, but maybe not so much directed towards improving the value of the products as they move their way through the supply chain all the way to the consumer. This is just for a contrast, another bull that's marketed heavily in the United States that is exactly the opposite. He still is pretty good relative to maternal EPDs and calving ease EPDs, but look at the difference in where he ranks compared to the rest of the population in his marbling EPD. This bull can have a lasting impact on the nature of how calves in the population respond to selection relative to a trait that I've just demonstrated for you is important for consumers. And this bull has had a big impact relative to that regard. Before I talk a little bit about these data, I have to thank Mark McCulley and John Sticka at Certified Angus Beef for helping me put together these data. But I thought they were data that you would be interested in. If you look at what has happened in the U.S., and I'll show you some more data that demonstrates this in a second, but if you look at what has happened relative to the amount of marbling specifically in cattle in the United States, even during the last 20 years, you can see a significant improvement not only in the cattle that are grading USDA Choice and USDA Prime, but it corresponds with increasing size of the animals. So while we're making the animals much larger, we're also selecting for and apparently improving the amount of marbling that's being deposited in the muscles of the cattle. Relative to Certified Angus Beef, which is one of those brands that you just heard about, look at what's happened relative to the sales of that brand during the last 30 years, last 40 years actually, since the brand's inception in 1978. When Mick Colvin started the Certified Angus Beef brand, he had a vision for helping the Angus breed sell more sires based on consumers driving demand for the product all the way up and down the production chain. And if you look at those numbers today in 2018, or just completing 2018, selling almost 1 trillion pounds of product, over 1 billion pounds of product each year, affecting over 5 million cattle each year, generating $75 million back to US dollars, back to cattlemen. You have to think that promotion of eating quality to consumers using a breed that helps to improve the consistency and the elevation of that eating experience has had a huge impact on selection for these traits in our industry. And it has therefore impacted the number of sires that are sold every year and that are registered every year in the American Angus Association. So just to look at what that means in terms of total cattle, if you just go back to the year 2000, you can see that just sort of selling 100,000 certified carcasses each week. And that is an amazing amount when you consider where the brand started from in 1978. So what has happened in the last 10 years? As there has become more incentive at the consumption level of the industry to produce a higher quality product that is also associated with a brand that meets the criteria that you just heard about. There's been a shift in the numbers of cattle that end up qualifying for certified Angus beef from 9.2 to 18.5%, and there's been a reduction in the lower quality parts of our industry in the U.S. USDA select grade carcasses going from 33% of the population to 17% of the population. This has had a dramatic impact on the value of the entire industry in the United States. If you add up all of these percentages, these are the percentages of increased value of moving from USDA Select to USDA Choice, and then beyond USDA Choice to certified Angus beef. So all of these values essentially are additive, and if you add those up, it's about a 50% improvement in value of the carcass as a consequence today of meeting the demand criteria that are imposed by consumers for higher quality or higher eating quality beef. The last thing I don't want to spend too much time on, because I'm certain there's others that will know much more about it, I want to talk about how Angus fits into a crossbreeding system. I know in Uruguay and in other parts of South America there's an awful lot of Hereford cattle, and I won't say anything disparaging about Hereford cattle, but they do have an opportunity to be improved relative to eating quality characteristics. And so even in systems where you're looking to improve over one trait, the response relative to the phenotype of the cattle, crossbreeding provides you an opportunity to do that. In fact, if you look at numbers that have been generated, at least based on US data, there's about a $70 per cow improvement, $70 US per cow improvement, when you compare a F1, just two-breed crossbred calf, in contrast to a purebred cow in the purebred cow-calf sector of the industry. If you go further with that and you generate a composite, and you'll end up with the true breeding composite that'll add about 75% or 75% to the line, and you'll actually improve the value of your cows in that over a long period of time by about $315 per head over the lifetime of a cow, if you figure that the average lifetime of a cow is roughly 6 years of productive calf production. So this offers us an opportunity. If you look, what has been studied mostly relative to heterosis has been the benefits in reproductive traits and in pre-weaning growth traits associated with the crossbreeding program. What you have to ask yourself is, in a crossbreeding system where we need to improve the quality characteristics of the final product that are going to be marketed to consumers, what that benefit's going to be relative to use in this type of a system. Maybe Dan will talk more about that later today. So where I want to go with this is what we've done in the United States and what has been conducted here in Uruguay relative to addressing the production chain as a whole. This is a pretty famous mathematician, statistician. His name was W. Edwards Deming, and he had a philosophy that if you could manage into a production system quality, then you wouldn't have to wait until the product was already manufactured to begin to sort off the good from the bad products relative to quality. He was very famous for helping Japan reestablish their modern business practices after World War II and achieving the quality of products that some of you in here would be familiar with, for example, in Toyota automobiles. We've tried to adapt this philosophy in the cattle industry by incorporating a production system up and down the chain, and recall that it's very independent parts of the chain, where we implement Dr. Deming's philosophies. And his idea was to control quality at every step. So you control every input, the processing at every step, and with an eye to making sure that nothing is wasted, nothing is wrong, so that the final product is consistent, predictable, and reliable. And if you think about the independent sectors of the production chain in beef cattle industry, that becomes difficult to do. We've been working on it in the United States since about 1991, and we started a program that's called the National Beef Quality Audit to address issues associated with quality as it's perceived by consumers up and down the production chain, to help producers determine what they need to work on to improve those attributes. Our philosophy, if you believe in Dr. Deming's goals, is that everybody in the supply chain has accountability and responsibility for addressing their components of eating quality that will affect the demand for the product downstream. So we have in the United States sometimes what's called the It's Not My Job Award. And what we're trying to do in the beef cattle industry is make eating quality and consumer demand the responsibility of everybody in the production chain. Part of the way that we do this is every 5 years we conduct the National Beef Quality Audit. The last one was finished in 2016, and we rolled out the data during the year 2017. The first part of that study is to essentially interview, using quantitative methods, the different sectors of the beef marketing chain: packers, retailers, food service, further processors, and folks that are associated with the beef production chains, like government agencies and trade organizations. When we interview them to make this a quantitative estimate of what the demand is for various components of quality in the beef production chain, we divide it into what we call 7 quality buckets or quality factors. So all of the answers that you're going to see relative to our quality audit are based on these 7 categories or 7 buckets of quality that reflect what consumers want in the beef products that they purchase. Now in this study, everybody gets to determine what these 7 buckets mean to them. So we don't tell them what they mean, they tell us what they mean. And so the first thing I wanted to show you relative to data from this study is, what does the bucket of eating satisfaction mean to those different sectors of the industry? And you can see that by far and away, the way they answer the question is always customer satisfaction. And to them, then, that's broken into categories associated with tenderness and flavor. When we ask them about cattle genetics, we kind of expect them to give us a response about using EPDs and various other techniques, molecular techniques, for improving the traits associated with genetic selection. But in fact, that's not what they tell us the answer to that question is at all. In other words, the question is what do cattle genetics mean to you? And what they end up saying is that about 1/3 of the time, it means breeds of cattle. And so in the marketing system in the United States, of the companies that we interviewed, 29% of the packers, 29% of the retailers, 40% of the food service people, and 42% of further processors actually use the word Angus when they answer the question about use of cattle genetics in the selection chain. The other part of the study that we conduct is an economic study. The economic study is essentially a measurement over time of what customers of beef products, people that make purchasing decisions in the supply chain, are willing to pay for quality attributes associated with the product. We break this into two categories that we call must-haves and willingness to pay, a premium. What this means is that to be a must-have, the purchaser won't make the decision to buy the product at all, absolutely, unless it has these characteristics. And we test whether or not in the system that that's actually the case. And then above and beyond what must be incorporated into the product, we ask them, what if we could add this component of quality to the beef, what would the willingness to pay be for you as you make your purchasing decisions? That data looks like this. These are actually probabilities. So these are statistical probabilities that each of those sectors of the industry must have either of those or any of those 7 buckets of quality that we talked about before. You can see that in the US, by far and away, food safety rules the day. So food safety is the most important trait in the United States. But after that, particularly for retailers and food service, you can see that eating satisfaction becomes the most important trait to them, and it becomes, at least a third of the time, something that they require in the transaction before they'll make the purchasing decision. And by the way, the arrows on this slide indicate whether the probability associated with that characteristic went up or went down or was equal to the same probability that was computed from the last audit in 2011. When I show you the data associated to the willingness to pay, you can see that for almost all characteristics, the supply chain is willing to pay more to achieve the desired quality traits associated with the products across the board. Particularly related to eating satisfaction, though, those numbers are huge. And in fact, at the retail level of the industry, there's about an 84% likelihood that retailers would pay more for product that provides greater eating experience to the consumers. And so that's a huge number. And it's an opportunity for cattlemen, if we consistently provide that eating satisfaction to the retailers as part of their day-to-day business. The question is did the numbers go up or down relative to the amount that they would pay more for it? And in fact, because beef is improving in quality, as I showed you a bit ago, the amount that the different sectors of the industry were willing to pay compared to 2011, when the last audit was conducted, actually declined. So what this means is more retailers and food service companies are willing to pay more to achieve the characteristics that are important to them in their business, and particularly eating satisfaction. But even though there's more of them that will pay it, on average, they're willing to pay less to achieve those traits. And that's a consequence of us doing a better job and trying to match their needs over the last 20 years. Last thing I'll show you from our study is the relative importance ranking. This is something that we do. It's kind of like doing a strategic plan. It's quantitative in nature, and it's based on the odds that something is more important than something else when they make their purchasing decisions at each of the sectors of the supply chain. And when you look, I've circled for you there eating satisfaction. Interestingly, eating satisfaction is quite a bit less important than food safety to the packing sector of the industry. But as you move across to the retailer, food service, further processor, and even the government and trade organizations, you can see that it ranks number 2 in terms of its importance. So even when you relatively rank traits associated with the products, eating satisfaction still comes in either 1 or 2 every time. When we asked them to tell us what the strengths of the beef industry were in the United States, they told us across the board that it's product quality. So this is good news to us, as we've conducted this study since 1991, is via genetic selection and other management practices, we're improving across the board the perception of the quality of the product that's being marketed to consumers. And so if you look at the challenges that our industry faces, starting out in 1991 and moving across all of the audits that have been conducted to 2016, and I'm one of the few people left that's been involved in all of those audits, you can see that since 2011, food safety and eating satisfaction sort of flipped back and forth in terms of becoming the two most relative important aspects that we need to maintain in our supply chain to maintain beef business sustainability. Last thing I want to show you is just some data from packing plants that we collect in this study. It's interesting to me that over the years we've conducted this study, the number of cattle that end up coming to the plant with black hides or black hair coats, color, has grown to 58%. So about 58% of the cattle have some sort of Angus influence in them in the United States today. That number for the Holstein dairy cattle that you see, 20%, actually grew between 2011 and 2016 by 15%. It went from 5% to 20% in a short period, in 5 years. And so now there's also a portion of the beef industry in the United States that are feeding Holstein cattle as a byproduct of the dairy industry to also address some of those quality characteristics. In the packing plants, we looked at about 9,100 cattle from January to December 2016, and that included about 30 of our largest plants in the United States. When we break out estimated breed types, about 90% appeared to be native carcasses when they're evaluated as carcasses. That number has declined, though, from year 2000 to the 2016 audit. And you can see that a higher proportion of the carcasses that are being slaughtered are dairy-type cattle. One thing that we haven't slowed down is increasing our carcass size, and you can see that even in 2016, these are in pounds, but our carcass sizes continue to escalate. This is a growing concern in our industry because all of the mechanical equipment that we use to harvest and to process cattle were designed to handle cattle that are much smaller than this, and that ends up becoming a problem for us. In support of what I showed you earlier, the marbling, the percentage of USDA prime and choice cattle is growing, and in fact, for the first time in my lifetime, surpassed the 70% mark when we conducted the 2016 audit. So that means that selection is having an impact on the quality aspects of the cattle, in spite of the fact that the cattle continue to become larger in size. These are just some statistics associated with quality grade and yield grade in the United States. I won't dwell on these other than to tell you that even in these data, quality grade appears on average to be improving in the U.S. supply chain system. So we concluded this study by essentially saying that we continue to work on 3 things in the U.S. They include food safety and animal health, eating quality and reduction in inconsistency and variation in eating quality, and then optimizing value and eliminating waste. I want to leave you with just a couple interesting notes that I've witnessed. Starting in the early 2000s, we helped the Uruguayan, so INAC and INA began the process of developing a similar type of quality audit in the Uruguayan production system. And I want to share with you some highlights of those studies. They've conducted their studies in 2003 and 2008, and then the last of those studies was conducted in 2013. I want to share with you some of the outcomes of those quality audits. So you've already seen this, but these are essentially characteristics of the Uruguayan production system, similar to the U.S. system, except for a couple of things. The cattle are much smaller in size. There hasn't been the economic demand creating very large cattle and the population. And the Uruguayan system does not use any growth promotion technologies in their production system. In 2003, when they completed the audit, about 50% of the slaughter makeup of the industry was based on Hereford breeding. Another 15% were experiencing heterosis, the way I discussed earlier, because they were Hereford Angus crosses. But only about 6% of the population were Angus cattle. So remember that number as we go through these slides. 6% were Angus purebreds in 2003. If you look at how they performed from a carcass quality perspective, they actually weren't too great. You can see a high proportion of the cattle would have qualified in the U.S. system for what becomes the standard grade, which is less desirable from an eating quality perspective. And many of them would actually have fallen into the utility and cutter grades, which are manufacturing cattle in the United States. Their marbling and composition looks like something like this. That PD stands for practically devoid, meaning that there's not much marbling in 2003 in the Uruguayan production system. So let's go through then and see what these look like. In 2008, we still have about the same number of cattle grading as Hereford versus Angus in the population. And the yellow to the left, the 6.9%, reflects the numbers that were full-blood Angus or black cattle in 2008. You can see that in terms of marbling, there's not a great deal of increased marbling showing up in 2008. So the quality, the eating quality characteristics of the carcasses were relatively similar in 2008 to what they were in 2003. And even if you contrast the Uruguayan population to that of the European Union, which has relatively similar production systems, you can see that the Uruguayan system was producing, on average, less marbling per animal that was evaluated. And that distribution in 2008 looked very similar to what it looked like in 2003, with a high preponderance of marbling scores being in the traces and the slight marbling scores of the distribution. In terms of grade equivalence, then, if you compare these back to 2003, you'll note that there wasn't a great deal of change between 2003 and 2008, and still a high proportion of the carcasses fell into what would be equivalent to the standard grade. Let's fast forward to 2013 now. In retrospect, we can do this, but it will help you see why it's important to continue to do these studies. Angus cattle now comprise about 18% of the slaughter in Uruguay. So they've moved from 6% in 2003 to 18% by 2013, so in 10 years. And if you look at just the steer proportion of the market, of the cattle coming to harvest, that number is even greater. It's about 25% of the cattle being harvested. And you've got to figure that there's some crossbred cattle in addition to that that are a consequence of the greater use of Angus sires within the Uruguayan production system. Look what's happened to the marbling scores simultaneously. So I have not done an epidemiological study, but I think it's pretty clear what's happening here. As the proportion of the Angus sires that are used in Uruguay has increased over time, you can see that the marbling scores are also beginning to increase. And in fact, now you have a much lower percentage that are in the traces and slight category than before, and you're starting to see carcasses with small and modest marbling scores, even in grass finishing systems used in Uruguay. So that's a consequence of the increased numbers of Angus sires being used in the industry, moving from 2002 to 2013. And if you look at what's happened to marbling across those three studies, so the pink bars are 2003, the yellow bars are 2008, and the green bars are 2013, you can see that the distribution, the standard bell-shaped curve for marbling scores has moved to the right on that graph as the number of Angus sires have increased in use in the country of Uruguay. So I think, even though we don't have statistical proof that that's happening, it appears pretty clear to me, and it reflects almost identical data to what we've seen happen in the United States as we've made similar measurements in our industry. So kudos to all of you Angus breeders. With that, I will stop, and again, I thank you and thank the organizing committee for inviting me to talk to you this morning, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.